Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, but it's something I hope is going to be a start of a new series here and something that gets us into talking a little bit more about the explicit and implicit links between some of our favorite series and the concepts of psychology. So without much further explanation, let's get into it. So today we are talking about Psycho-Pass. So Psycho-Pass is one of my favorite anime, at least the first season in the movie. And it's a really one of the more modern, like super interesting anime that explicitly deals with psychological concepts, which not all of them really do, at least quite in the same way that Psycho-Pass does. So it's something that's been really interesting for me, and something I've talked a lot about with friends and other anime fans about maybe what these kinds of things mean. Now, with this all being said, I will say that if you are unfamiliar with the show, I will do some explaining of it. And if you haven't seen it, there will be a lot of spoilery kind of information here. So I will give you an opportunity to switch off here if you don't want to hear any sort of spoilery plot things, because beyond here, that's what will happen. But anyway, to talk a little bit more about the series, if you haven't seen it or if you're not interested, Psycho-Pass, the idea is that the main characters are a team of law enforcement people and also potentially part criminals that live in this society that is run by a system that keeps track of people's psychological health called the Sybil system. And the system takes these measurements and readings on people, and in order to influence public things and to keep society running smoothly. The main characters interact with the system because they are law enforcement, and the law enforcement agency that they work for uses what is called someone's Psycho-Pass in order to determine who are criminals or who are potential criminals. So there's sort of a minority report kind of element to this of there's future crimes. They pursue people that are called latent criminals in Psycho-Pass. And the idea here is that if someone's Psycho-Pass comes up being problematic, the system singles them out, they get treatment, and if things go too far, as in they think they're going to become dangerous, they're going to become a criminal, they're going to kill someone or harm someone, the law enforcement agents get sent after these people, and they get sent in when big incidents arise. And this sounds kind of like a basic, pretty cut and dry kind of concept. You've seen some similar things to it before, but the twist is that there's a lot of other weird things that go on in the anime, and there's a lot of backroom weird stuff that happens that makes it, much more complicated than that. Obviously, right? But for our purposes here today, we're going to limit ourselves to talking exclusively about the titular Psycho-Pass. I'm hoping this will be a part of a series where we'll talk a lot more about the different bits and pieces in this show. But for today, we will just talk about the Psycho-Pass and how it relates to psychology. So, speaking of the actual Psycho-Pass, the show is named for sort of this metric that gets used within the context of the show's world that is used to assess people for a lot of things in society, but for the purposes of what we're talking about here, their latent criminality, how likely they are to commit a crime, be violent, things like that. So, within the context of the show, someone's Psycho-Pass consists of a few different elements. The first one is hue, relating to color. So you are given a color every time your Psycho-Pass is red. And the way they read these is sort of mysterious. I've seen explanations that indicate that it's like by vibrations or something, but basically speaking, you're given a color, almost like a mood ring, every time your Psycho-Pass gets red. And there are drones and there are check-in stations and all these things that read your Psycho-Pass regularly. The second piece is your crime coefficient. So when you are red, when your Psycho-Pass gets red, you are given a crime coefficient. A low crime coefficient is good. A high crime coefficient is bad. A high crime coefficient indicates that you have potential to be a criminal. And indeed, about a decent half of our main characters actually have fairly high, or at least unacceptably high, crime coefficients because they are criminals. And they are used by law enforcement because they have particular skills that involve them finding criminals or helping apprehend them. So it's sort of like hiring a thief to be security, right? That's sort of the idea. The third component of a Psycho-Pass is something that I'll call area stress, or that's something that involves psychohazards. And these are related to events that happen with criminals, but we'll talk about them later. It's not explicitly included on one psychopath, but it is a component of psychopaths because it has the potential to affect a lot of people's psychopathes. So let's get into talking about hue first. So hue, as I said earlier, is based on color. So the idea here is that you want light, potentially bright colors. Now, this isn't necessarily explained, at least in my experience with psychopaths, very well, but the idea is that lighter colors, brighter colors, are good. They indicate people that are not stressed out. They indicate people that are functioning well. And what you don't want is a clouded hue or a dark hue. So you don't want a black, you don't want a dark blue, dark green. When you get your psychopaths red, it gives you a number, it gives you your crime coefficient, but it also gives you tracking of what colors your psychopath has been. And it's expected that someone's hue will change over time, potentially over courses of days, hours, minutes even. But your hue changes, especially with regard to stress. So the idea here is that you're wanting your hue to be light and you want to be unstressed. And potentially the society is all structured around this, right? You're trying to make people as not stressed as possible so that everyone's healthy. Whether that's actually happening or not, I don't know if I'm really qualified to answer that within the context of the show. One thing that I don't know that it gets explained to us about hue, about color, is what the colors mean exactly. So what does red versus blue mean? What does green versus pink mean? I don't know that they ever quite explain it. I've heard some people say that it might be related to like personality types or personality traits. I'm not actually sure that the show explicitly talks about that or any of the related media. And I will say that I'm not an expert. I haven't seen all of it, so maybe it does and I just haven't seen it. But let's talk about hue for a second. So this feels like it's kind of out there, right? It feels like it's related to mood rings, which are not really a thing, kind of. But one way I would maybe draw this to psychology is to talk about the science of emotion and how people experience emotion. So I had a client once who could explain all of their emotions through color. All of their emotions had a particular kind of color and hue. And so they would explain, I was feeling angry, and that anger was orange, for example. There was a difference between anger and frustration. There was a difference between sadness and, happiness. And they used these distinctions to talk about the different ways they experienced emotions. And I would bring this in here to say hue kind of has this related thing. That if it's related to stress and it's related to your emotional state, maybe hue kind of makes at least some vague, abstract psychological sense here. That you want bright colors, you don't want dark, you want, colors that correspond to people having positive emotions in this case. Now, I don't necessarily think they actually explain it this way, as in you want these kinds of things, but I think it's worth mentioning that, I have seen this used this way, especially when talking about emotionality. And it would make sense here that if the psychopath is measuring people's psychological states, we would maybe measure their emotional states, if that's possible. I don't know that it is in terms of like an actual psychological science kind of way, at least in the methods they're using, but it is potential, right? We know that parts of brains light up for certain emotions. We know that different things prompt different stimuli. So in some ways, this is actually fairly plausible in that you could potentially take someone's emotional state and translate it to a color. Whether that color means anything inherently, who knows? But there is some interesting bits here about hue. The next thing we're going to talk about is someone's crime coefficient. So you can see here in the picture I've shown you, which is straight off of the wiki for psychopaths, this is what somebody's psychopath's results look like. And it gives you numbers, it gives you the color, and as you can see, this person has changed their color and their numbers over time. As you can see, they are in a decent range here in terms of colors and numbers. But the idea here is that your crime coefficient is this all-important number that involves whether law enforcement is going to come after you or not. So, basically under 100, and this is all information from the wiki, and I'm not going to read it to you, but this is important information, so I just copied it here. Under 100 is considered fairly normal. The police officers cannot use their weapons, which are called dominators. They cannot use them on you. They're actually physically unable to because the device will not work on someone who has a crime coefficient lower than 100. And so you want a low crime coefficient. And arguably, you assume that average citizens will be somewhere well below 100. You hope fairly low, right? But some people maybe have stressful days. Things happen, so maybe they get closer to that. Arguably, the people that have low crime coefficients are people we don't actually spend time looking at very much in the show. I mean, some of the main characters do because they're civilians. They'll scan somebody who is not affected by it. But these are people that don't get spent time on. Although it is important to note that in the universe of psychopaths, there are people who have abnormally low and incorrect crime coefficients. So it is known that people that have psychopathy or sociopathy are actually unable to be read correctly by the system. So their hue comes out as white, colorless, because they don't have any, emotional state, but also any sort of stress to go with, right? They also will read as a 0 on a crime coefficient, which is incorrect because maybe those people are criminals and they murder somebody in front of you while maintaining a 0, which is incorrect, right? The majority of people we probably encounter within the context of Psychopaths, the show, are people that are what is called latent criminals. These are people that have a crime coefficient between 100 to 299. And these people are classified as latent criminals. That means you can use a dominator on them. But it is only authorized to be non-lethal. So what typically happens in these circumstances is someone's a latent criminal, you catch it early, they maybe haven't paid attention to their own rating, they send someone in with a dominator, they stun them, they take them to some sort of psychological facility where they get treatment, and then they're, released back into society. Is arguably what you want to happen here. Preferably, you want them to not actually have committed a crime, right? Because you don't want violence and you don't want these kinds of things. So often what will happen is, this is somebody who maybe doesn't even have to commit a crime. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they are about to commit the crime, like they get caught in the middle of it, something like that. The third category here is someone who has a psychopath crime coefficient of over 300. These are people that are determined to be a serious threat to society that lethal means is authorized on. The dominator will kill them pretty spectacularly if used on someone with this high of a crime coefficient. Now, this is important because of the wording, that they pose a serious threat to society. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a one-to-one correlation between what the crime is. It doesn't necessarily mean if you stab someone, if you are going to stab someone, you warrant lethal execution. Now, potentially that ends up being functionally true, but in the context of the show, I don't think that we get that kind of information, which is maybe important to note. Because if there isn't a one-to-one correlation between crime and crime coefficient, what are we actually measuring here? And this is actually one of the things I want to bring up with regard to some of the problems with the crime coefficient. So my argument here is, what are we actually measuring? If we're measuring stress, hue already is supposed to do that. If we're measuring something like people's externalizing coping or their attitudes towards others or their risk factors, okay, maybe that makes sense. But how do you determine that? And the fact that recovery comes from psychological sources indicates to me that what we're actually talking about here is mental illness in some way. That potentially people that have dangerous mental illnesses or mental problems that would cause them to lash out are what would be measured by the crime coefficient. Because I don't know that we really see people that commit nonviolent crimes so much. The show doesn't really talk about it as much. So that's maybe important to note here, which is kind of a problem because, as I mentioned earlier, people that are psychopaths or sociopaths can't be measured by the psychopaths, or they can, but it's incorrect. And this means that in a lot of ways, psychopaths and sociopaths might be the most likely to commit crimes. They have the least regard for societal rules. they are more likely to take advantage of people or harm people, potentially. And I'm not saying this is always, but by and large, maybe is more true than not. But this becomes problematic because then if we can't measure these people, what people are we measuring? And that's the problem I take with the crime coefficient, because there's a huge idea out in the world that people that are mentally ill are dangerous. And that's actually not true. People that are mentally ill are actually much more likely to be victims of crimes than to perpetrate crimes. And so, in some ways, if we've removed the most dangerous, the most scary of people that have mental health issues, now we're talking about people that have maybe totally treatable, totally normative mental health conditions who are being maybe criminalized in the society. And I would maybe, there's a lot of other background to this, but that's maybe part of the problem with the crime coefficient, because we don't know how it's being used or measured, and also it is very much determined by what the society does or does not value. In a world where you're probably trying to give off the impression of not being stressed, of not being violent, of being courteous and a perfect citizen, what are the things that we would suggest would be atypical here? And this is where I get into things of, like, if you've lived in a big city or even not, and you've seen somebody who has a mental illness that is struggling, they can do some very potentially scary things, or at least potentially abnormal things, that aren't threatening to anyone, but are potentially threatening to society in terms of what the society looks like. And that's a problem I have. I think that, with the way that the society in Psycho-Pass is portrayed, that's a real concern. And, I could talk about this forever, so I'm going to move on here. But just these are some of the concerns that I have. The last thing we're going to talk about here is area stress and psychohazards. So this is an interesting one that actually has some basis in psychological fact, but in Psycho-Pass, the anime, and in the movie, but specifically in the anime, you get shown this idea that when in an area, they have an average of people psychopasses. So when somebody rates as having a high crime coefficient, it raises the average of that area, which is useful for scanning in this context because it tells you there's been a spike for some reason. It throws off the average, right? If it has a higher than average, we need to go look at that, which does make sense here. But also it is said that in the context of the show, crimes, things that are affecting other people, can actually increase and affect their psychopaths. So for example, someone committing a crime, a murder, say, in your area, would maybe increase the psychopathies of lots of people in that area because they are more stressed, because they are more likely to act out. Which, in psychological terms, does kind of make sense, especially in stress, right? If you live in a neighborhood where crime is happening, you're likely to be more stressed than others. So that makes perfect sense. But Psycho-Pass actually takes this a step further to say that potentially, if you are the victim of a crime, it could push your psychopath into latent criminal territory, where you would also need some sort of treatment and some sort of rehabilitation, which is sort of true in terms of real-world psychology. There's the idea that people who are abused abuse others. People who are transgress against others. And that's not necessarily always true, but that idea is out there. But this kind of gives the idea that mental health in Psycho-Pass is almost transmissible. And there's actually some interesting data in the real world that suggests that on some level this has an element of truth. One of them is mass psychogenic illness. So this used to be called mass hysteria, but there are lots of cases throughout human history of weird mental health issue seeming stuff transmitting amongst populations. One of these was the dancing plague in Europe, where people would just start dancing for no reason all at once. Another one was more recently, I showed this video in one of my classes, talking about young children who develop these spontaneous symptoms that there's no medical cause for, and that they were transmitted across time, across spaces, and that's sort of true, that this can happen, that illnesses can compound, create stress, and potentially create further illness. But another darker version of this also exists, that there is something called suicide epidemic and also potentially depression epidemic, depending on who you ask. The idea here is that if someone commits suicide in an area, you want to go and talk to the people affected by it, who see it, who are exposed to it, to convince them, to make them aware of resources so they do not commit suicide themselves. And this is a big deal, because this is why portrayals of suicide are extremely important, because you want to do it in a way that doesn't cause more harm. And this is why things like 13 Reasons Why were very concerning for the psychological community, because if you're exposing people, potentially susceptible people, to these ideas, to these things, are you going to set them off even more? And I don't know that Psycho-Pass actually describes it this way, but there is some psychological truth to this. Now, the way that Psycho-Pass handles it almost suggests that in some ways, mental health is sort of like a plague or an aerosolized disease, a virus of some sort. And that's not necessarily psychologically true, but it's really interesting to think about here. So this has just been sort of a brief overview of what the Psycho-Pass is and what that means. But let me give you some final thoughts and reflections on some of the problems that we'll hopefully continue to talk about here. But a big one for me is that this is all based on society. And arguably, because Psycho-Pass is made by, Japanese man, Japanese studio, Japanese team, this in some ways reflects Japanese values. And Japanese values on mental health are very different than other places' values. And the valuation of civilizedness and harmony and those kinds of things maybe in some way inform how mental health is being shown here. And in some ways contributing to the idea that people that are mentally ill are criminals or are potential criminals, which again we know is not necessarily true, at least compared to a normative society sample. And this is worth talking about because in this way, Psycho-Pass sort of negatively portrays mental health in an incorrect, improper way. Also, that it takes some of the exceptions and makes them interesting sort of story compelling things, but doesn't maybe do enough to explain what they're actually talking about here. Because if this idea is that like people that are stressed out commit crimes, I mean, kind of true, right? There's a correlation between high temperatures and violent crimes, right? Because if people are too warm, they get angry and then they do these things. But the real world is a lot more complicated than that. And so in some ways, Psycho-Pass sort of overly simplifies this in a way that could be harmful. Another thing is that we're just talking about the Psycho-Pass, the actual thing here, but combined with the whole system, there are some significant concerns. And I hope to spend some time talking about the other components of the show Psycho-Pass, but suffice it to say that for me, this creates a lot of potential problems, right? Because if you're just showing people this side of mental health, if you're suggesting all of these weird things to them about who criminals are, what they do, how it affects society, it becomes very easy using this portrayal to really demonize the mentally ill and to target them in some ways, right? And the show doesn't talk about this too much, but what happens to the people when they get treatment? Obviously, they're supposed to go get psychological treatment, but do they come back? Is there stigma? Is their world completely changed? Do they even recover? I think the suggestion is yes, they in fact do, but that's something worth mentioning here, and something that another problematic piece that I want to think about here is that we're putting psychological tools, psychological concepts in the hands of law enforcement. And traditionally speaking, that's not their role. And obviously they have these wonderful tools in this society and there's lots of sophisticated technology, but there's a lot of concern here of the reason we have psychological professionals is because they need lots of training, right? They have to spend lots of time learning how to use these things and these concepts and knowing what to do with it. And is the problem that we put it in the hands of law enforcement, we put it in the hands of government? And I would say yes, right? Because I'm a psychological professional, of course that would be my opinion. But, I'm curious what other people are thinking about this. We've talked a lot about different pieces here, and I'm curious Maybe did you learn something? Are there links that you hadn't seen before? Are there things you'd want to talk about further here? I'm hoping I get to spend a lot more time talking about the Psychopath series, especially getting into very specific things like the Dominator and the system and society. But on that note, I am going to wrap myself up here. I would love to hear from people in the comments if there's interesting things that maybe I missed or things that you'd make sure I want to talk about next time. But anyway, with all that being said, I will catch you in the next one.